can you grow your own chicken feed? Well, yes, you can, but you probably can't grow it the way you think of chicken feed if you've been buying chicken food from the store in a bag that's heavily grain-based. So you can grow lots of things that your chickens will love to eat, but how much of the diet you can provide from things you can grow versus still having to buy feed entirely depends on how many chickens you have and how much land space you have to do it. But we're going to look at the types of crops you can grow to feed your chickens and the nutritional requirements that those crops are going to meet for your flock. The first thing to think about is how are you going to provide the energy for your flock, so the starches, the carbohydrates that form the basis of their calorie intake. In a commercial bag of feed, that is provided mostly by grains like wheat and barley and oats and corn, things like that. Now, those are pretty challenging to grow on a small scale, and they usually need specialized equipment to be able to extract the grain from how it grows. So generally speaking, that's not what you're going to be doing. The easiest thing to grow for energy for chickens and people are potatoes. So that is the classic peasant crop since it was put around the world. So potatoes, they grow in small spaces versus how much they produce. They do need to be cooked, but potatoes are a good option as the basis of the starch and energy in your chicken's diet. There's lots of other things that can be grown on a small space. Things like winter squash, so pumpkins, they store. Chickens like to eat them. You can cook them or not cook them, depending on what you want to do. And they also provide some protein and fat from the seeds inside, so a good option. And then you have root crops. Carrots, turnips, potatoes, radishes, all these sorts of root crops. Now, they generally need to be cooked for chickens to be able to digest them, so that's an extra step in the process. But there's lots of options, including some beets and radishes that grow really, really big and they store well through the winter, so that can be a good choice to keep your chicken flock fed. My flock really like eating summer squash, so things like zucchini, courgettes, that kind of thing, but they're not a crop that stores well, so it's pretty much just something they get over the summertime as a good little extra boost to their diet. If you did want to try growing grains, there's a couple of ways you can do that. The most effective way to grow grains on smaller spaces is to grow maize. So any corn that's going to dry down to store. It's a lot easier to manage by hand because they're big and you can just grab them and then it's ready to feed. And if you wanted to grow wheat or things like that, I would recommend growing that sort of as a crop that you cut and throw to the chickens as an enrichment activity. So you're not going to try and extract the seeds and store them because that's very fiddly and that is done on big scales with big equipment. So grow them in strips, cut them, throw them to your flock. They'll get a bit of food and lots of fun from that. And then we're talking about green crops. Now those aren't going to provide a lot of energy, but they do provide a lot of nutrients. So things like your brassicas, kale, bok choy, cabbage, although cabbage often does need to be cooked for chickens to be able to eat it properly. And lettuces, which grow really well, and these all grow quite well in the winter if you've got a mild climate, and they often still grow even under cover in harsher climates. So things like that. My chickens love silver beet or Swiss chard, and that actually produces a pretty decent root underneath once the green crop is finished, and you can cook that and feed it to the flock. So that pretty much covers the options on smaller scale chicken feed production from an energy perspective. But let's talk about protein. Protein is one of the hardest things to produce for yourself, both as people food and chicken food. Luckily, chickens like to eat bugs, and most people aren't too keen on eating bugs, so we can produce quite a bit of protein for our flock by raising bugs. In my case, I have lots of worm farms, and the chickens get a fair number of worms, but it doesn't form a huge amount of their diet that I'm growing the worms just for them. They get a lot of bugs from free ranging. So worm farms farms are good. You can also make a mealworm farm, which are a bit easier to manage and they can be done indoors, or black soldier fly larvae farms, and you can find out all about those. There's lots of YouTube videos, but protein is really, really important. You've got to make sure you get the protein in, and animal protein is the best quality and going to give you the best health outcomes for your flock. So make sure if you're going to try and grow food for your flock, you're getting the protein component knocked out. A less labor-intensive way of providing food for your flock are tree crops and vine crops. So that's things like grapes or kiwi. They just grow, they grow really, really well, and they just drop fruit for your chickens. And chickens are an animal from jungles and forests, so they're really happy with that kind of food delivery system. You can grow fruit trees like plums and apples, things like that, in temperate climates, and there are a lot of options. And if you're in a more tropical climate, you can grow mangoes and bananas, and chickens love all of these things. Or nut trees. Now, nut trees take even longer to establish generally than fruit trees do, but if you already have a source, that's great. Hazelnuts, walnuts, oak trees with acorns. Chickens can eat acorns. With nuts, you do need to be able to smash them a bit so the chickens can get in, but nuts provide a really valuable source of fat and protein. So if you can find or grow some nut trees, that's a great way to really get your flock fed. One of the strategies that I use to provide lots of nutrition for my flock is I manage my lawn as a pasture. And what I mean by that is I grow a wide variety of legumes and grass species in my lawn. And when I mow the lawn, I mow it at a point, so quite a high point, so that I'm maintaining the grass at a growing point. So it stays fresh and young and actively growing. And then the chickens can actually eat that young grass, and they eat quite a lot of it in my case, and that's a great easy way to add extra food and nutrients to your flock without having to do too much work or many changes to what you're already doing with your lawn. Unless you have a very small flock or a very large property, you probably aren't going to be able to produce your entire flock's diet from what you're growing yourself, but it's a really good way to offset how much feed you need to bring in. I think it's a really good idea to get the skills needed for providing a portion of your flock's diet, because you never know how expensive or how available chicken feed is going to be from the store in these times that we live in. Just really remember, it's super important to make sure that you're getting enough protein into the diet of your flock. So double down on that insect production, or free range if you have the space. It's going to be easier to produce food during the spring and autumn than it is during the summer and winter. So keep that in mind if you need to grow crops to store for your flock for those harder to manage seasons. But really, it's about figuring it out for yourself. What can you grow? What will your flock eat? How does it work for you? But just make sure you watch the health and behavior of your flock to make sure that they are getting everything that they need from their diet.